Lord be with you. A reading from the Holy Gospel according to Matthew. A reading from the conclusion of the Holy Gospel according to Matthew. The 11 disciples went to Galilee, to the mountain to which Jesus had ordered them. When they saw him, they worshiped, but they doubted. Then Jesus approached and said to them, "All power in heaven and on earth has been given to me. Go therefore and make disciples of all the nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit, teaching them to observe all that I have commanded you. And behold, I am with you always until the end of the age." The Gospel of the Lord.
In a special way, I'd like to welcome everybody who's come back to campus this weekend for the Alumni Weekend. It's great to have you back here at Notre Dame. One of the things and primary responsibilities I have here at the university is to teach. And this past semester, I taught a new course that was called The Heart's Desire and Social Change. The course offered a chance for students to read some interesting books on discernment, spirituality, calling, justice, and mission. But it was also a chance for them to read something more of their own inner lives. And given how busy we've become in recent years, how frequently we're plugged into cell phones or computers or media devices of every kind, it's ironic that we have so little time to listen to what's happening inside of us, in our hearts, in our souls, from where the truest self before God emerges. And in the course of the semester, we covered a number of different themes, such as the sign of the times, the social problems of our day, our foundational experiences, the metaphors we use to describe those experiences, our working theology which guides our lives, and the significant influences and books and scriptural texts that shape our lives. In brief, the course was a chance for us to look at the text of our own lives in the context of our society today and discover more about what God is calling one to do. But at the very end, I asked the students to do an exercise in which they had to reflect on both the next chapter of their lives and the last chapter of their lives. I asked them to spend some time writing what could be considered their funeral homily, one that gets them beyond what David Brooks calls our resume virtues, namely those things which allow us to get on and move and get promoted in the world, but how they're distinct from eulogy virtues, namely those virtues by which we really want to be remembered. And it's amazing how different these virtues are from each other. And thinking of the next chapter and the last chapter of their lives invites them to think wisely about who they are and ultimately where they're going with their lives. Well, today we celebrate the Feast of the Ascension, and it's a time that marks, if you will, the next chapter of Jesus' life and mission, but it also points to the last chapter, when he comes again in glory. I would like to suggest that this feast is a way of inviting us to keep our minds and hearts focused on the big picture, namely the reign of God, on what really matters and how it shapes and directs our lives. The Acts of the Apostles tells us something of the foundational experience and the spirituality of the early church. There are certain elements of history here, and some of these are marked in very concrete locations even today. If you have gone to Jerusalem or plan to go there, you will remember that on the Mount of Olives there is a small domed structure with a small stone inside that marks the events and the place of today's readings. But there is a significance here beyond history. It's also how God comes to us in our own times. In fact, St. Bernard of Clairvaux said, "There are not two comings of Jesus, but there are in fact three. The first is his coming in flesh as a human being. The third is his coming at the end of time. But the second is his coming to us right now, in the Spirit, in our own life, in our own concrete experience. Jesus comes to the door of our own hearts, and he knocks. And he does not and will not enter by force. He invites us to open the door, to let him in, to allow him to dwell in our lives, to carry our burdens, to lead us, and through it all, to allow his love to reign in our hearts. The readings in this sense are about allowing that love to really guide and direct our lives, rather than fear, worry, anxiety, envy, resentment, bitterness, or so many other inner toxins which really contaminate the soil of our own hearts. In Paul's letter to the Ephesians, he says, "May the eyes of your heart be enlightened." In other words, may we look at our lives through the lens of God's love for the world. Perhaps this is why in the Gospels, Jesus orders his disciples to meet him on a particular mountain. We do not know for sure what mountain that was, but given that it was done in the context of his teaching, it's plausible that the mountain that he was referring to and the mountain where he met his disciples was in fact the Mount of the Beatitudes. And it was from there he invited them to live in a way that speaks of dependence upon God rather than rugged individualism, on mercy, meekness, humility, peacemaking, and purity of heart, rather than willfulness and dogged determination of really one's own agenda. But as we look at how society really functions, we might ask ourselves, perhaps like the disciples did, is living in this way really practical, possible, or even effective? The disciples in the first reading asked, "Are you now going to restore the kingdom to Israel?" We can hear them adding in the background, "When we will now be in charge, when we will have authority, when we will be the ones who rule the land, and we will be the ones in power." The gospel tells us that they saw Jesus and they worshiped, but they also doubted. They worshiped because he rose from the dead, but they doubted because he told them to observe all that he commanded them from that mountain. Like the disciples, we may listen to these words and find them too impractical, perhaps idealistic for our daily lives. But like the disciples, we may find ourselves both worshiping Jesus, but not quite sure these teachings still work. But this is where Jesus takes us deeper into our hearts. And he reminds us that if we're really going to work for change in the world, as he has, it can only come if we allow God's love to really rule and direct our lives. It does not come through power, through money, through arrogance, through war, through deceit, or through greed. When we stand with God on his mountain, we realize that what changes the world is not the love of power, but it's the power of love. It's the power to forgive. It's the power to serve. It's the power to give ourselves away in such a meaningful way that it connects our lives to others. He knows this is not easy, and there is a suffering involved with laying down one's life in this way. He knows we will be hurt. He knows it will involve sacrifice. But through it all, he reminds his disciples, "Behold, I am with you always until the end of the age." He helps them realize that our greatest power is, in fact, in our communion with God. It is indeed a privilege to work with students as they look at the next chapter and the last chapter of their lives. But these chapters and these themes come into particular focus really at the end of people's lives, particularly when they face some crisis or difficulty. And I remember recently when I was talking with a person who was diagnosed with cancer and who was facing the end, I asked him, when the last chapter of your life is written, how is it that you want to be remembered? He was a very accomplished person and very successful, but he did not point to his money. He did not point to his titles, his degrees, his possessions, his stock portfolio, or even his accomplishments. He said, what I have learned is that what really matters in the end is friendship, his connection to God and his connection to others. We might put it this way. In this Feast of the Ascension, we recognize that even though Jesus has gone above, that what he really calls us to and what we are seeking in the depth of our hearts is in fact communion. Communion with God, communion with others, communion with those who have gone before us. Jesus has gone before us and ascended into heaven ultimately to unite all of us together. And today's feast is about God's desire for friendship with us, and in turn, our call to walk through this world as friends. Everything else is secondary. In that spirit, let us, in this Eucharist, enter more deeply into God's friendship and communion with him. Here, we meet the Lord who has come to us in the flesh, who comes to us today at this moment, and who one day will come again in glory.